Jeeps. We all know them, we all love them. Well, I mean, unless you're a Toyota guy, but that's besides the point. Point is that Jeeps are known for being the go anywhere, do anything off-road vehicle. The only downside though, is that they suck when it comes to fuel mileage. Well, what if I told you that you can have a vehicle that's like 5% Jeep, but gets potentially 35 to 40 miles per gallon? No, I'm not talking about slapping a Jeep badge on a Prius. I'm talking about creating a 4-inch lift by installing Jeep springs on a VW Mark IV Golf. Now, okay, sure, it may not be as capable as a Jeep with its two-wheel drive and whatnot, but I mean, come on, it's a frickin' lifted Volkswagen. It's frickin' rad. And despite its handicap, you'd be surprised at where these things can go when properly modified. Now, the springs we'll be using to achieve this lift are the stock front Jeep Wrangler JK springs for the front of the Golf and stock front Jeep Cherokee XJ springs for the rear of the Golf. The vehicle will retain both its stock front struts and rear shocks, although some modifications will have to be made to make them work properly with the extra lift. And I'll explain all that later on in the video. But without further ado, let's get started on this thing. Alright, so we're going to start off this project by lifting the front end of this car. Well, you know, installing the lift on the front of this car first. So obviously let's lift up the front of this car and take the wheel off. Next, go ahead and disconnect the sway bar link from the control arm. You can keep the bolt if you plan on retaining the sway bar, otherwise go ahead and toss the bolt if you're doing a sway bar delete like I'm doing. Remove the bolt that clamps the steering knuckle to the bottom of the strut. And remove any wiring that's attached to said strut. Now, this part only applies to the passenger side. In order to remove the strut from the knuckle, you're going to have to unbolt and pull out the control arm a bit to give some extra clearance to the axle shaft to drop down. Find your favorite hammer or mini sledge and, well, in the words of Mel Gibson from the movie Signs, swing away, barrel. After getting it at least halfway off, it may be necessary to pry the control arm a bit more and turn the wheel to get more clearance, but continue to swing away until it eventually separates. This next step should really be completed using a pass-through socket set to remove the top strut bolt. And I even went through the trouble of buying a cheap set at Harbor Freight just for this job, but only to realize that the set I got only goes up to 19mm and the socket requires a 21, so nuts to that. So instead, I just used an impact gun and managed to zip it off pretty quick. Is it the right method? I don't know, but it worked, so whatever. With that top strut bolt removed, your strut will probably just be laying in the wheel well, waiting to be plucked. Now that the strut is out of the vehicle, we can now start to disassemble it. Compress the spring using a McPherson strut compressor, which can be rented from most auto parts stores. Once you get enough tension off the top hat, unscrew the bolt retaining the top hat and remove the top hat, the strut bearing, not this thing, and the upper spring plate. What's the not this thing, you ask? Well, this car already had a 2-inch lift installed, and that piece is what gave the front end most of its 2 inches. However, if you're working on a bone stock car, you're more than likely not going to find this on your strut. With the strut mount, bearing, and strut plate removed, we can now loosen up the strut compressor and remove the spring. Now that we have the old spring out, we can compare it to the new Jeep Wrangler spring. As you can see, it's substantially longer than the stock spring, and unfortunately that extra length is going to make fitting it onto the strut a royal pain in the ass. That rental strut compressor I got isn't long enough to grab enough coils to compress it short enough to fit onto the strut. Now sure, you can do some sketchy ass stuff like pre-compressing the spring with ratchet straps to make the tool grab enough coils, but honestly, if you're in my situation, it would be easier just to pay a shop $20 to have them compress and mount these springs. Now, speaking of struts, there's something really important that we need to discuss, and that's strut length. The stock struts on these cars are obviously not designed to fit a longer Jeep spring, and as a result, they stay almost fully extended even under the weight of the vehicle. I originally installed this lift without any modifications to the strut, and learned very quickly that the strut maxed out with a very jarring on almost every bump I hit. Continue driving like that would surely destroy my struts in no time, but I did find a solution. 2-inch strut extenders from a company called Eurowise, designed to screw onto the ends of your factory strut to make them 2 inches longer. After installing these things, I've never once had an issue with my struts maxing out, even in off-road situations. In my opinion, these things are a must-have when installing the Jeep lift. Alright, so back to the strut assembly. Assembling the strut is pretty much going to be the opposite of how we disassemble it, with the exception of adding that 2-inch extension and of course the Jeep spring. Be sure to add some Loctite to the strut's original threads before screwing on that extension though. After you get both struts modified and assembled, you're probably thinking, we'll just slap these bad boys in now, right? Wrong. There's another step that I originally overlooked, but modified later on after suffering the consequences. Underneath your wheel well liner is a pinch weld, which, if you're running larger tires like me, will slice into your tires under certain conditions. Therefore, it may be necessary for you to hammer this seam over and flatten it to get more tire clearance. Next thing we need to talk about is the sway bar. Now if you plan on keeping it, then you can go ahead and just ignore this section. However, if you plan on actually using this thing off-road like me, then you're going to want to ditch the sway bar. Not only will this give you a softer ride, but it'll also greatly increase your suspension's articulation and therefore increase traction. There didn't appear to be any easy way of removing the sway bar, as it looked to be trapped between the body and the subframe. So I found it easiest just to cut one end off and then slide the rest of it out. Okay, now we can talk about slapping them bad boys in. Because these struts are now 2 inches longer than stock, they're going to be harder going in than they were coming out. For me, I found it extremely helpful to unbolt the control arm as well as the tie rod and brake caliper from both sides of the car to get the most maneuverability and clearance to get the strut into the knuckle. On the passenger side, we once again have issues with the axle shaft bottoming out on the subframe and preventing the knuckle from dropping down far enough to get the strut in. Now, I know I can just unbolt the axle and move it out of the way, but honestly, I think it was easier just to grind this little lip off right here, which gave me the clearance I needed to get the strut in. Speaking of getting the strut in, a little trick I learned to get it into the knuckle is to use a small wedge of some sort and tap it into the slot here to spread the gap, which will then make the strut slide in with ease. From here on out, it's just standard reassembly procedures as usual. Secure the strut to both the knuckle and the top strut mount, wrestle the control arm back into place, reattach the tie rod, reattach the brake caliper, and lastly, mount the wheel back on the car. Alright, you got the front end all buttoned up? Is it looking good? Alright, well let's move on to the rear of the vehicle then. To install the rear lift, we're going to have to do both sides at the same time, so go ahead and jack up both sides of the rear. After taking off the wheels, go in and take out the shock absorbers. I find it easier to unbolt the top first, then the bottom. After removing both shocks and ensuring that all wiring is out of the way, press down on the axle and the stock spring will practically fall out with ease. Now before we go any further, there's something very important we need to discuss. Look around online at how to do the Jeep lift on these cars, and you're almost guaranteed to be misled into using late 90s F-150 shocks in the rear. The shocks on these F-150s are designed to carry a payload of up to 1,700 pounds, and as a result are a hell of a lot stiffer than the stock VW shocks, which are only designed to handle about 900 pounds anyway. So unless you plan on hauling about 1,000 pounds in the back of your car, you're going to end up with a rear suspension setup stiffer than an unloaded dump truck. How do I know this? Well, I was foolish enough to try it myself when I first installed this lift. And let me tell you, it was like breaking your back every time you hit the railroad tracks. Needless to say, I had to come up with a different way of going about this. And so, this is what I came up with. I made some 4-inch long shock extenders to weld to the existing shock mounts. The way I made them was using 2 pieces of 2-inch angle iron and welding them together to make a box tube. Now, obviously I could have just started out with some 2-inch square tubing, but I didn't have any at the time, so I just used what I got. Once welded together, my box tube was the perfect width side to side to fit the bottom of the shock, however it was slightly too narrow front to back to fit. So I had to cut a small section out to make clearance for the shock to slide in. Lastly, I measured and drilled a hole on each side for the bolt to slide through and hold the shock in place. Now of course, you don't have to build your shock extenders exactly like mine, especially since, well, I'm not exactly an engineer. But I hope this gives you a basic idea of how to solve this shock issue. Now, as far as attaching the extension to the car, I just welded it to the existing shock mount. I did have to trim some meat off the mount though to make it sit flush with the extension, but once the trimming was done, it was pretty straightforward to weld it in place. Now as you can see, I already have the new spring installed in this shot. It is possible to install this shock extender either before or after installing the spring, although in my opinion it's a lot easier to install it before installing the spring. It's just that in this case I fabbed up these extenders about a week after I originally installed this lift with the crappy F-150 shocks, so the springs were already installed. Speaking of springs, let's move on to that subject. As you can see, the Cherokee springs that are going in the rear are a lot longer than the stock VW springs, and with that added length brings added troubles. With the axle drop down as low as it can go, the axle spring perch is sitting at nearly a 45-degree angle compared to the top perch where my hand is, which makes getting the spring into position pretty damn difficult. A little trick I came up with, which worked pretty well, is bringing out our old friend the ratchet strap and ratcheting down only one side of the spring, making it curve into sort of a macaroni shape. That curve was just the ticket to make the top of the spring seat into position. Without removing the ratchet strap, go and install the spring on the other side. Once that's done, we can now lift the axle back up and start compressing the spring under the weight of the car. You don't want to lift it up all the way though, just enough to the point where you can install the shocks. It's at this point that we can now remove the ratchet straps. With the springs in place and the shocks bolted up, there's really only one thing left to do, and that's slap the wheels back on and see how she looks. With the stock tire size installed, you can really get an idea of how much lift we put into this thing. However, it does look pretty ridiculous with these tiny tires, so let's upgrade to something a little bit bigger. Yeah, now there we go. This set of 215/75/15 general grabbers fit perfectly on it and truly complements the lift. Additionally, I also threw on a set of 20mm spacers. It wasn't totally necessary as it seemed to have enough clearance before the spacers were installed, but I really dig the slightly wider stance that it has now. Now, at the time of making this video, it's actually been a full year since installing this lift, and I have nothing but good things to say about it. It drives really well on the road, and its suspension is surprisingly soft yet firm enough to not feel like a land yacht on the corners. Its off-road capabilities, however, are where this thing really shines. Now, it's certainly no rock crawler, it just doesn't have the gearing for it, but it's proven itself on a handful of mild wheeling trips and backroad explorations with my local Jeep club and has gained a bit of a reputation for it. Having said that, if you're looking to turn your boring little Volkswagen into a unique little off-road machine that turns heads everywhere you go, then the Jeep lift, my friend, is for you. Thank you for watching this video. I certainly hope it gives you a good idea of what needs to happen to tackle this project. Got a question? Comment below and I'll try and answer it in a timely manner. And of course, if you like this, well, you know what to do. Take care now.